Ladies and gentlemen, the 20th century was a century of upheaval and modernization. Politically, it was to see colonialism defeated by the rise of nationalism and decolonization. Totalitarianism of various stripes and its ultimate defeat by the democracies. In art, it was to see the rise of abstract art and the broad applications of the telephone, radio, cinema, and television, the first true mass media for entertainment and social connectivity, the last being crowned by the appearance of the internet. In architecture, the 20th century saw the largest transformation in the history of that art, as engineering and new materials, seen on a large scale for the first time in the 19th century, with such iconic achievements as the Crystal Palace by Paxton in 1859 and the Eiffel Tower in 1889, would come to dominate construction. And as urbanization, mass housing, and the emergence of the middle class were to transform societies. The emergence of true globalization and the international style after the Second World War would be part of that profound transformation as the modern movement evolved from the early part of the century into its last quarter and the post-modern movement appeared. Hassan Fathy was to be a part of that scene for his whole life, but always as a counterpoint, a dissenting voice that called to architects to take a different path. This is the story of that remarkable man and his ideas. The Egyptian architect Hassan Fathy was born to a wealthy family on the 23rd of March, 1900 in Alexandria. When he was 8 years old, he moved to Cairo with his family and settled in Helwan. He was talented in drawing, which was to stand him in good stead when he joined the King Fouad University to study architecture. In his formative years, he witnessed the 1919 revolution and Egyptian independence in 1922. Fathy graduated in 1926 and took a job as an engineer in the local council's affiliated general administration of schools. In 1930, he was appointed as instructor at the Faculty of Fine Arts, where he remained until 1946. Now, during that first half of the 20th century, Europe was in turmoil. Modern art flourished, and movements such as Futurism in Italy, epitomized by speed and motion, and such sculptures as Umberto Boccioni's Bronze and Santelli's vision of the future city were at the forefront of that expression. Constructivism in Russia was to influence architecture, as in this Zuev Workers' Club of 1928. In addition, Art Deco emerged as an embrace of bold design, machines, and technology, as well as bold geometric shapes and lavish ornamentation. But by the 1930s, the bold leaders of the modern movement in architecture had emerged. Walter Gropius with the Bauhaus in Germany, Le Corbusier in France, and others. Their work was impressive. Mies van der Rohe with the great Barcelona pavilion of 1929 with its fabulous, timeless chairs. And buildings such as the Schroeder House in Utrecht by Rietveld in 1926, or the Villa Savoye in France in 1928 by Le Corbusier, or the Tugendhat House in Brno by Mies van der Rohe in 1930, all epitomized this new modern movement. In America, Frank Lloyd Wright was to hew to a somewhat different path with a truly unique and evolving style all his own, from the Roby House in 1910 to the spectacular house on the waterfall of 1936. But generally, it was the emerging ideas of the futurism, modernism, and constructivism that melded into the deification of the machine and the birth of the modern movement in European architecture that would anger Hassan Fathy. Fathy would start his attacks on the modern movement and the international style that it would engender in the late 30s, confronting such giants as Le Corbusier in the forums of the Congrès International des Architectes Modernes, or SIAM, and calling for an architecture of humanism and a vocabulary of forms from local vernacular architecture. That was to isolate him from his peers who were trying to join the modern movement, and some of them were indeed successful. Thus, my own father, Anis Saragildin, had on one of his designs featured in the New York Times of 1937 as an exemplar of modernism's use of glass. Between 1949 and 1952, Fathy was appointed director of the Educational Buildings Department of the Ministry of Education. And in 1953, Hassan Fathy became the head of the architecture department at the Faculty of Fine Arts in Cairo University until the late 50s. During these years, he designed what was to become his flawed masterwork, the village of New Gorna, an architectural masterpiece beset by socio-economic issues beyond the control of the architect. He was recognized by state awards, but was increasingly out of step with the modernist trends ruling supreme in the architecture schools of those days. In 1959, he left Egypt to work for the Doxiadis organization in Greece for 2 years, but returned to Egypt and resumed his activities. His long career continued, but he was marginalized by his peers as he remained true to his vision with a dogged determination. He wrote about his experience in a book that was to make him famous, Gurna, A Tale of Two Villages, which when reissued in the West as Architecture for the Poor would become a major text for all architectural students in the world. Fathy was an international figure of stature, even if in Egypt the mainstream views and the teaching in the architecture schools still tended to reject his ideas. He did consulting work for the United Nations and the Aga Khan Foundation, and took part in numerous international and Arab conferences where his ideas found receptive audiences. Despite having erected very few buildings, Fathy had become an international superstar. Hassan Fathy served on the first steering committee for the Aga Khan Award for Architecture and was technically barred from being considered for a prize. However, a special award, the Chairman's Award, was created for him. He was also the first architect from developing countries to receive the gold medal of the UIA, which is the International Union of Architects. Finally, recognized at home and abroad, Hassan Fathy was laden with honors when he passed away at the age of 89 on the 30th of November, 1989. But what about Hassan Fathy, the man? For many, he remained an enigma. The purity with which he pursued his vision of the truth, his unwillingness to compromise his standards, and his devotion to his art and his craft have always been a great inspiration to all those who knew him and to many students who have simply heard of him. But his message had a resonance of ambiguity that came from a populist who was nevertheless a member of the elite. In Hassan Fathy's life and character, there is a striking noblesse oblige of the aristocrat, the intellectual, of a member of the social elite of his country. It is somewhat ironic that Hassan Fathy, whose name is so closely associated with architecture for the poor, built much for wealthy patrons. Just like the great master of Western architecture, Frank Lloyd Wright, Hassan Fathy's genius was initially appreciated mostly by an intellectual and wealthy elite whose private commissions remained the important body of his built work. Like Wright, Fathy built for them structures that drew upon a local environment, which in the hands of a master were transformed into a better vision of the reality from whence they sprang, using familiar imagery but remaining categorically distinctive. The paradox of the situation is sharpened in the case of Fathy, since his concern with rural architecture and community building found its expression in 4 great projects. 2 of these were public commissions that were plagued with problems due to socio-economic circumstances beyond his control. New Gurna, undoubtedly his masterpiece and most well-known work, and New Bariz, largely unbuilt. Both were architectural and planning successes flawed by external socio-economic considerations. The other 2 were private commissions. Lu'lu'at al-Sahara, built for the epitome of the wealthy Egyptian elite Hafiz Pasha Hafifi, and the Islamic community effort in the United States in New Mexico, which was still under construction at the time of his death. Now, these are hardly the means of guided self-expression for the rural poor that he spoke about. And his other famous buildings were private residences, mostly for the rich and well-to-do. And yet, such criticisms are unjustified. To many young architects and planners in Egypt, Hassan Fathy's intellectual and personal integrity shone through the isolation and adversity that an indifferent government bureaucracy and architectural establishment forced upon him. His is the triumph of ideas. The few projects that were known to us, mostly Gurna, were so powerful in their immediacy and their aesthetic appeal that they eloquently expressed the integrity as well as the artistry of their creator. In retrospect, to most Near Eastern architects, Hassan Fathy was the dominant figure in the architecture of Egypt in the 20th century. He was a controversial figure, and one whose impact was widely acknowledged but not quite understood. Although he had been a continuous presence on the scene for almost 60 years. Nevertheless, during those 6 productive decades, he had always been peripheral to the mainstream of building activity, of architectural education, and of decision-making in urban matters in Egypt. But peripheral to the mainstream does not mean easily discountable. His persistent presence had sometimes infuriated, sometimes disconcerted, always challenged those who were most influential in building matters in Egypt. His intransigence baffled some who saw him as a lonely guru reminiscent of Old Testament prophets promising that the world will reap misery for not listening to the truth of his message. But his strength was the strength of ideas more than buildings. In his long and illustrious career, he had built only about 30 projects. Furthermore, with the exception of Gurna, his most well-known and widely respected work, few of Hassan Fathy's buildings were known to the wide public. Yet his name and ideas are widely acknowledged. So what were those ideas? To undertake an appraisal of the intellectual contributions of Hassan Fathy is not an easy task. Perhaps his most significant legacy would be the humanism that he championed and the boost he gave to the self-image of architecture in the Third World generally, the Muslim world especially, and in Egypt in particular. He elucidated his position over the years with a remarkable clarity, courage, and consistency. Fathy was not enamored by modern forms. He recognized that architecture is for human beings. This was not just the affirmation of a simple truth. It represented an alternative paradigm to the prevalent modern understanding of architecture and its role in society. The paradigm can be sketched out by spelling out the various themes that comprised its various elements. Architecture is for humans. Cultural authenticity, non-interchangeability of cultures, adopting scientific measures as arbiters of choice, the participatory nature of the design process, and individualized attention to each building. That is the Fathy paradigm. Fathy articulated cultural authenticity as a main theme of his message. He rejected architecture that was not indigenous, rooted in the location and the culture of the area, which in his mind found its truest expression in the vernacular architecture of a society. He opposed an international imported expression that is rooted in a common technology rather than a common humanism. And he championed an indigenous architecture with its vernacular heritage. Now, in so doing, Hassan Fathy reaffirmed a central element of his major paradigm: the recognition that architecture is for humans and that human beings are not interchangeable, requires that architecture must be responsive to their psychological and cultural needs as well as their physical and physiological needs. Fathy therefore rejected the elements of internationalism that were to try to unify the world in a common pattern of living derived from a common technology, regardless of where it was being applied. And his rejection of internationalist modernism thus went beyond a rejection of westernization of a cultural heritage that he considered an important part of his identity. His rejection was of internationalism itself as a homogenizing concept that stripped human beings of their individuality. In defending cultural authenticity, Hassan Fathy emphasized that there is an essential non-interchangeability of culture. By that he meant that basic cultural elements developed in response to indigenous needs, environmental and psychological, and that alien elements cannot be implanted or transplanted from other cultures or other environments if they are culturally inappropriate. Culturally inappropriate elements that are so inserted into the fabric of the harmoniously built environment will undoubtedly generate contradictions and will with time corrode and degrade the traditional culture. He was careful, however, to note that a living culture must always remain open to the world and borrow as well as invent new things. There is nothing wrong, he would say, for us to take from the West that which is suitable. Now, it was the difficulty of defining what is suitable that led him to encourage architects to use as determinants of suitability the objective measurements of science, such as thermal efficiency, cost, energy efficiency, and other measures of the suitability of materials and of the relationships of spaces and volumes. He was open to the use of appropriate technology, even if it was not indigenous technology in the narrow sense of the term. He thus did not hesitate to transplant dome building techniques of southern Egypt to the villages of northern Egypt. This was particularly suitable for a time when wood for shuttering was expensive, labor was plentiful, and mud brick was the local building element throughout rural Egypt. In addition, it was suitable to the climate. And he himself launched an experiment around 1970 in which he tested 7 chambers built in different techniques to identify the suitability to Egypt's climatic conditions. But in his own studio, in his own work, he dealt with the much more subtle aesthetic aspects of the suitability of form to indigenous expression. Now, in this domain of nuances, his yardstick was his own aesthetic sensibility, much more so than arid historical scholarship. Another element of the paradigm that Fathy erected step by step was the participatory nature of the design process. He encouraged self-help and promoted user participation in design. In some instances, he allowed the peasants to express their wishes for the layouts of their homes. In other instances, he let the peasants use a courtyard for a number of days and then established the layout of the courtyard on the basis of their use, defining the pathways where the earth had been beaten by their steps. In designing the village streets in Gorna, he accepted that the farmers live with their animals and thus allowed ways of having the animals enter the homes from external entrances, as he allowed the small street to be for human use and interaction. All these efforts are examples of Fathy's persistent attempts to introduce further individualization in the design process. On the philosophical level, Hassan Fathy stood against the dehumanizing bureaucratic approach to mass housing with its endless repetition of prototypes in ever-shifting combinations. He could not accept the assembly line approach to architecture. He advocated individualized attention to each building and housing unit. And he was fond of offering an analogy that the greatest brain surgeon in the world, if given 200 operations to do in one day, would surely kill all his patients. He admonished us young architects to never take commissions of more than 15 to 20 units at a time, to deal with users as individual clients and persons and not as prototypes or generic average families. Architects, he asserted, had to remain true to the human dimension of their vocation if their work was to retain its meaning. Hassan Fathy's ultimate contribution, and possibly his most important, was to shift the attention of architects, however briefly, from the mainstream commissions of major buildings towards the problems of the poor. He was concerned with the masses of humanity that were living in poverty and identified directly with the problem of shelter for the poor. He became one of the prime advocates and the most powerful voices of the social consciousness of architecture in the 70s and early 80s that merged with so many countries that have exploded throughout the universities of the world in the 60s. The upheaval that the 1960s wrought throughout the Western universities was matched by an age of equally important upheaval in Egypt. Intellectually, Egypt passed a milestone. At that time, national priorities shifted from the pursuit of sovereignty and national independence to the pursuit of social development. In parallel to that change, the old icons of the established order were being questioned. And Fathy started his third major community building effort, New Baris, at that time. But the war of 1967 stopped that project as national priorities shifted back to foreign policy considerations. But internationally, this socially oriented climate born of the 1960s was particularly receptive to Fathy's ideas of humanism, national authenticity, and concern with the poor. By the late 60s, Fathy found a responsive echo in some Western universities. In Egyptian universities, however, the disciplines that was to remain most insulated from the new currents of thought and architecture remained captive of the modern movement. Repetition of the dictated models of the Western masters of the 40s was the order of the day. Even during the 70s, the time when modernism was being called into question in the West, there was no rising wave calling into question these same ideas and theories in the East. Ultimately, Hassan Fathy's work and his ideas would be legitimated by being rediscovered in academic circles of the West. And after an intellectual odyssey that lasted 40 years, widespread recognition finally came in his own home country by the late 70s. Although it must be noted that partial recognition had been granted to Fathy in 1967, when at the instigation of some far-sighted university professors of architecture, he was awarded the Egyptian Order of Merit. That, however, did not lead to significant commissions or widespread academic acceptance in Egyptian universities, which, for the most part, remained indifferent, though not outwardly hostile to both Fathy and his message. This prolonged lack of acceptance only served to motivate Fathy further in the pursuit of his cause. But as time went by, Hassan Fathy's emphatic manner in preaching his truth forced upon him a number of positions that were etched with a hard edge, and made it impossible for some of the subtleties to remain in the message. And this, to my mind, led many of his followers, if not himself, into three broad shortcomings from which the school of thought whose seeds he had planted is still suffering today. First and foremost among these shortcomings is an overly romantic vision of the past combined with a mystic understanding of Islam as a culture and a presence in society. It is the flip side, assessing and asserting an indigenous cultural identity and the intensive pursuit of authenticity in expression. This pursuit has undeniably contributed to an elaboration of counterpoints that sought to emphasize the otherness of the Western modes of thought and thereby underline the differences between the West and the East, between the non-Muslim and the Muslim society. Now, the emphasis on defining the difference created among many would-be disciples a stark image that bore little resemblance to the reality of muted variations and of infinite flexibility that scholars of the Muslim world have come to recognize and accept. Nor did this narrow interpretation of Fathy's much more subtle message recognize that in the same individual whose cultural identity Fathy and his followers sought to preserve, there was an innate, evolving synthesis of modernity and tradition. This synthesis was being wrought by the very nature of a progressing everyday life, a reality that cannot be fitted into the sharply defined categories that these limited intellectual constructs would imply. An example of this narrow interpretation is the assertion that only inward-looking courtyard houses are truly Islamic. This certainly does not apply to much of Arabia, where in Yemen, a remarkable heritage of vertical, multi-storied, outward-looking architecture shows a different conception. It is also incorrect to generalize such a statement to all social strata. Cairo, for example, a large number of persons lived in multi-family apartments called Raba, or plural Riba', which looked out onto the street. In pursuit of a humanistic architecture for the poor, and in his concern with the authentic Egyptian architectural medium, Hassan Fathy ultimately developed an extremely powerful architectural vocabulary and syntax, but one that was primarily rural. The forms and the medium, Adobe, that he chose to express them in were predominantly of a village architecture. Therein lay the second shortcoming. This vocabulary, being rural in character, has limited applicability in confronting the challenge of large-scale urbanization in the developing world generally, where high land values, massive urban densities prevail. There is a need to pursue a new paradigm for the aesthetic form of our sprawling urban metropolises, one that can cope with the standard office building, as well as contemporary technology, dense vehicular traffic, and especially make use of the new tools of contemporary technology. But to answer these questions, Fathy's work provides few clues, although his message of humanism and individuality remain important. Hassan Fathy's pursuit of an authentic cultural expression and the low-cost medium of building pushed him to experiment very successfully with vernacular architectural techniques, indigenous materials, and forms of guided self-help. Having achieved great success in these areas, he encouraged, and rightly so, young architects to look at and recognize the important wealth of experience and expertise that lay at their doorsteps, rather than always seeking answers amongst the imports. But at the same time, this intensive pursuit kept him from extensively experimenting with the new materials of the 20th century. And this, to my mind, is the third major shortcoming. In the hands of a master such as himself, with his assured use of volumes and forms, his understanding of a cultural identity whose structures, symbols, and instruments he had so thoroughly internalized, such materials would probably have produced a new set of expressions using 20th century methods and techniques. Perhaps that was not possible, for there is only so much that one can do in a lifetime. It is thus perhaps unfair to ask of one who has already given so much to the architecture of his country, his region, and even the world, why he has not given even more. But it is nevertheless important to highlight these points if one is to try to draw lessons from Fathy's work, to understand the limits of extending his findings to the problems of a contemporary urban metropolis. It is important to highlight these points to those who have claimed for Fathy's architectural vocabulary a universality of application that it does not possess, and that he, the most dedicated of individualists, who vehemently eschewed all cookbook recipes and always studied every problem afresh, would be the first to recognize. But let us look at the built form. The seductive simplicity so characteristic of Fathy's work is misleading. He was an accomplished architectural craftsman with an artistic eye for form, balance, and harmony. The learned casualness of his layouts and the almost austere simplicity of his facades owe much more to his creative genius than to the vernacular architecture without architects that inspired him. Through the years, he had worked and reworked some of the key elements of the architectural vocabulary in an unrelenting search for truth and oneness as he saw them. Now, it is wrong to imagine this visual repetition as an absence of imagination. Rather, it is the same perfectionism which is found in Goethe reworking the same manuscript for 40 years, or in Ingres and the late Picasso, who reworked many variations on the same theme, some of which appeared to be almost copies of the first work. Discriminating critics have recognized some of these themes. As Renata Holod and Dal Rastorfer said of Fathy when he received the Chairman's Award in the first cycle of the Aga Khan Award for Architecture, the architect accepted not only the forms of this building tradition, but the entire constructional system and its constraints. By working within it, he elaborated its spatial and structural aspects. What evolved from a close observation filtered through the architect's superb aesthetic sense was a distinct, clearly ordered universe of architectural hierarchies based on the juxtaposition of arrangements of the following elements: the squared domed unit, the rectangular vaulted unit, the semi-domed alcove, the breezeway and loggia, the courtyard. The urban forms of Cairo, which he so lovingly collected and to which he referred to in his sketches and his studies, served to enrich this architectural universe and provided models for later larger scale projects. By accepting the austere limits of both indigenous materials and construction systems, Fathy's work could not rely on color or surface texture for effect, except to the extent that his carefully crafted brick facade variations could be termed textural variations. Now, this imposed a greater importance on volume, form, and fenestration to achieve the overall aesthetic effect. This self-imposed limitation, however, was handled with such artistry that one does not feel that the imagery of the end product is in any way impaired. In fact, it is as if the quasi-monochromatic treatment of exteriors and interiors was a conscious choice to blend better with the surroundings and to heighten the sense of overall harmony that colors or contrasting materials would have ever so subtly disturbed. It is an evolving polishing and glazing of the work of art, drawing ever more deeply from the same well. There is a strengthening of a set of symbols that are gradually turned into signals, making the image sharper and the message clearer. He succeeded to such a degree that his message has been caricatured by insensitive critics as domes, vaults, arches, courtyards, mud brick. That is the same nonsensical oversimplification as saying that Mies van der Rohe's contribution is nothing more than a glass-encased steel box. In fact, by his later years, Fathy had elaborated a number of aesthetic standards, establishing geometric proportions for the elements of his architectural vocabulary that were very carefully crafted, but not as restrictive as the standards of the classic orders. On the other hand, some of Fathy's pursuits of a metaphysical symbolism in architectural design are really marginal to an appreciation of his own work. In his own hands, they may have helped, but in the hands of some of his disciples, this aspect has been turned into a veritable esoteric numerology. But architecture has to be experienced. In the absence of an actual visit, pictures are worth 1,000 words, especially in the case of Hassan Fathy, where many of his buildings have been so neglected that they are today unrecognizable. So let me show you a few pictures of some of the buildings of this great artist. Let's look at the simplicity of an early residence, the Hamid Said house. It uses the basic Fathy motifs that we came to know and appreciate. Now, these same motifs are also deployed in the larger and later Kazaruni house. They also reappear with considerably more sophistication and complexity in the Sami Aqil house. The variations on the vertical and the horizontal are like musical variations on a basic theme. They retain the overall character, the signature of the artist. The variations have been successfully adapted to the needs of different kinds of buildings, from a small ceramics factory to a small school. And these are the distinctive stylistic features of the built form in Gurna as well. But allow me to show you my favorite, the little mosque that he built in Gurna. Here you can see the enormous ability of the artist at work. The simple, serene, restful facade, remarkably well balanced, but actually innovating in form as well as function. No other mosque at that time had such a minaret with an ascending staircase in this fashion. The dome is simple, yet exquisitely balanced to cover the space underneath it and to bring in enough light. Indeed, the interplay of light and darkness provides echoes of shade from the harsh midday sun and openness to the soft afterglow of the late afternoon light of the setting sun. The cool interior is peaceful and invites meditation and spirituality. For the architect or the architectural critic, there is much in this subtlety that invites reflection and repays attention. On the outside, Fathy makes an ally of the harsh sun. He creates a pergola that casts these stark lines etched in shadow against the blank wall. In so doing, he evokes the classic ablaq stonework of many great Islamic structures, where alternating rows of dark and light masonry would create this series of horizontal lines on monumental facades. Fathy creates a muted echo out of sunlight and shade, appropriate for a small, peaceful rural mosque. Few in Egypt at that time followed that path. Few had the capacity to do so. Now, a rare and worthy exception was the great Ramses Wisa Wasif, a friend and occasional collaborator of Hassan Fathy, who created his own masterpiece in Harraniya, a village whose plan Fathy had designed. There, Ramses Wisa Wasif created an amazing community of young artists from poor rural backgrounds that he brought under his wings and whose talents in pottery and in weaving he nurtured. It blossomed into a world-famous location. And in that location, where his own house was found, we find the mastery of another great artist. Witness the rhythmic elegance of this facade. Look at the spaces he created. And here, in counterpoint to Fathy's Gurna Mosque, I would like to show you Wisa Wasif's incredible museum for the sculptures of Habib Gorgi. Notice the studied casualness with which he angled the interior of the plan from the exterior rectangle of the building, thereby creating an amazing sequence of totally different spaces, each suitable for particular presentation. Notice how he used the harsh midday sun of Egypt to introduce lighting into dark corridors, or even to light the sculptures in the alcoves as if with spotlights. But they are spotlights created by natural light. I chaired the second Aga Khan Award jury in 1983, which gave that building a prize. Regretfully, it was only to be posthumous, as Wisa Wasif did not live as long as his friend Hassan Fathy, and it was his widow and his sister who received the honor in his name. But returning to Hassan Fathy, what is the legacy of that great architect? His buildings are few and scattered, and his image in the minds of younger generations that have not known him or his work is dimmed by a new wave of technological advance and environmental concerns. The Bibliotheca Alexandrina, the new Library of Alexandria, decided a number of years ago that to be faithful to its mission, it should make a special effort on behalf of architecture. And a number of activities were launched. But one that immediately gained a special place in the hearts of both the management of the institution, the students and practitioners of architecture, and the public at large, was the idea to honor the name of the great Egyptian architect Hassan Fathy by giving an annual award in his name, and that was welcomed by all. However, a number of points are pertinent to underline about this award. Hassan Fathy was not only a brilliant architect in terms of his mastery of form and space and building technique, but he was also a person of principle who defended the ideas of an architecture of humanism at a time when the modernist wave of the 20th century was deifying the machine. Fathy would wage his sometimes lonely fight for decades, and it was only late in his life that he received the recognition that was his due. But beyond his convictions and his ideas, Fathy was an artist of great talent, whose architectural creations enchanted everyone by their seductive simplicity of form, their learned casualness of layout, and the interplay of light and shadow, solid and void, in always brilliant harmonies. Some have mistakenly reduced the legacy of his ideas to the vocabulary of domed structures and walled courtyards that were the characteristic of many of his structures that he built, to a simplistic message about the environment and local materials, or to an excessive attachment to the folk architecture of parts of Egypt. It is not the intention of this prize to reassert a style that characterized particular buildings that Hassan Fathy produced 70 or 80 years ago in totally different socio-economic and technological conditions. This prize is dedicated to those committed to an architecture of humanism for all humanity, to caring designs that nurture the well-being of people and community, to those who recognize that we must live in harmony with our environment, and to those who can see beauty in simplicity and not just in lavish expense and excess. To those who would struggle with the challenges of society today, from overpopulated slums to vast, ugly, but necessary infrastructure, to the need to recapture beauty, and to those who see architecture as serving the poor and the marginalized as much as we serve the rich and the affluent. The award also seeks to recognize those who toil to preserve the legacy of the past, as much as those who dream to create the icons of the future. It must pay particular attention to youth. As a result, there is an enormous range of projects that were selected for recognition by the award. Because the award seeks to recognize different parts of the vast canvas on which Hassan Fathy worked, from architectural writing and journals to interior design and decoration, from teaching and art to building methods and techniques, each year a steering committee organizes our efforts around a different theme or themes. By the diversity of those themes, the greatness of the legacy of Fathy is underlined. Long may it endure to inspire successive generations of young Egyptian architects to stand on principle and to build architecture that suits their time, but with a firm commitment to humanism. That is how we hope the legacy of Hassan Fathy will be truly kept alive by what the Library of Alexandria is now doing today. So, how could we sum up Fathy, the man, and his legacy? In the final analysis, Hassan Fathy's contribution to Egyptian architecture has been his image-making faculty, his ability to give body and form to a concept that was always recognized but that could not be easily seen, remaining formless and invisible simply by virtue of being all around us in the environment in which we live. It was his ability to charge with symbolism and to suggest and evoke the reality that emanated from the ontological substance of an Egyptian society that traces its roots from the mists of time through its most recent manifestation of a predominantly Islamic culture. This was the supreme creation of an artist, for art is an act of bringing truth into being. In effect, Hassan Fathy has shown us an Egypt which all of us knew in our hearts was there. He integrated the information which was available to all but heightened it by his sensitivity and his ability to discover something that otherwise would escape our attention. For Fathy picked from the world of Egypt many of the forms that he ultimately used to such good effect. But it was an integrating exercise. He transported the skills of the masons from Upper Egypt to the fertile lands of the Delta. He combined these with his own vision and emotional understanding of the myth of a bucolically pure rural Islamic Egypt. Then the sensibility of a wealthy patron or understanding client was all that was needed to enable him to transform his vision into the lyrical structures that have evoked such a strong, empathic, emotional response from all those who saw them. He speaks with incredible immediacy and purity to our understanding of such terms as serene, simple, calm, balanced, peaceful, and above all, beautiful. In the realm of ideas, his emphasis on self-help, concern for the poor, cultural authenticity, and individualism are now so widely accepted that it is difficult to remember the revolutionary character of his message when he enunciated it so long ago. It is an impressive legacy. It is a great privilege to have known him personally and to have been inspired by his voice and his presence. It is a great challenge to try to live up to the lofty standards that he has set for all of us. Thank you.